Hello and welcome to Efficient Strategy Gaming. Today I'd like to share with you the deck that I used to get into the top 100 of the Officers Club in Cards. So as you can see, I'm ranked 100 in the Officers Club here, and I just want to explain to you the deck that I used to get there. This is the deck right here. If you join my Discord, you can have access to the code to copy this deck, and I just want to give you a brief rundown of the deck. This is a basic Aggro deck, so Japanese Aggro, and it has a lot of standard elements to it that it has had in the past. So essentially what has happened in the new meta is that the Japan-German discard deck got nerfed. Okay, let's do a brief explanation of how Germany-Japan discard got nerfed. First off, case yellow only does 1 damage now. Your unit gets +1/+0 and the enemy discards a card. Before, you also drew a card as well. So this card was pretty OP. Now I would say it's just good. Island defense also got nerfed. So it is now draw a card if your HQ has 10 or less defense. Give your HQ +6 defense. So previously, this card gave you more defense if your HQ had 10 or less defense. The life gain also got nerfed from that discard deck as well as other decks. You're not going to get as much life gain as you previously would with Island Defense. The third big card that got nerfed was Dragon Slayer. When this becomes Veteran, it gets 1/1, but it used to have 4 defense before. So it would come down and then you wouldn't be able to take it out as easily. So cards like the Tactical Strike previously would not be able to counter Dragon Slayer, but it can now because it deals 4 damage to a unit in the support line. So that's another nerf, but I say if you're doing Japan control, I would still consider adding Dragon Slayer because it's still pretty beefy and it has to be dealt with. It's going to draw aggro, and if your opponent cannot remove that card, you're probably going to win the game. Okay, back to the deck here. We've got 3 Type 94 TKs, and you can remove units with the surprise attack. You can also combine Blitzkrieg with this card. Works very well since it has a 0 operation cost. So it's basically just a frame that you could stack bonuses onto. Type 93, there's 3 of these. It can be countered if your opponent has cards that are able to basically deal 1 damage to a lot of different units on the board. So that is the one thing that I've noticed. And the way you get around that is just by playing your units little by little. Try not to flood the field unless you're trying to set up a Shinano or something like that. The Shinano will distribute damage to enemy cards equal to the number of the cards on the battlefield. So I usually play Type 93 late, or right as I'm about to attack, or right as I'm about to play Blitzkrieg combo or a Shinano combo. Moving along, we have the Bicycle Regiment, and the big deal here is Fury. I usually play this a little later and let some of the other units draw aggro first, because this card with the Fury sets up a really good combo with Blitzkrieg. The next unit is Yokosuka, and that just basically gets big. It's something that your opponent has to deal with, but of course it only has the 1 defense. So it can be swept out of there fairly easily with a multitude of cards. Cards that you're going to use to counter this are going to be Tora, and then a card that's a little more expensive is Under Fire. So Japan counters Japan aggro, basically. So I feel like Japan control is pretty dangerous against aggro, but perhaps wouldn't be as good as some other decks. Signal Regiment, if I pick Signal Regiment up in my opening hand, I typically win unless they remove it fairly quickly. One Japan card that can remove that is Raiding Brigade, and Raiding Brigade is excellent. It can also counter some of the cards that you see that are like guards that only have a 2 attack, and it counters Britain really well. So to make this work, you're going to need a Raiding Brigade at least. Expansion gives you draw, and you have enough 1-drop Japan cards to where you could typically get it to work. What I like to do with my opening hand is make sure that I have at least 1 card that draws more cards. It could be Type 94K, but that would be the poorest version of an opening hand. But if you have an expansion and you can combo it with 1 or 2 of these 1-drops, it works great, and you just start that flywheel going. Another kind of card that starts a flywheel is Panzer 1B, and when this becomes Veteran, you draw draw another Panzer 1B, and it becomes 2-2. So the veteran gives you draw. That's mainly why I have it. And if you play it turn 1, it can't be countered by Bloody Sickle or Desert Rats. Pretty good if you draw this in your opening hand, or if you draw it as like a second card. Good early, not so good late. Flak 37, again, is just a cheap 0 operation cost card that can come out and take out your opponent's Type 93s. You can also use it as a frame to stack Blitzkrieg. So just one of these is good, and it's pretty handy early to mid. Late game, not handy so much. Cavalry Regiment draws a lot of aggro because of the 3 attack, and then it replaces itself. What I like to do with this is play this one earlier if I can, because it's going to replace itself, and then there's less of a chance for me to draw another one. The worst thing that happens here with Cavalry Regiment is if you have one in hand and then you draw a second one. So that actually happens quite a bit. It's not the end of the world. You'd still be able to get 2 from the ability here, the Destruction. I like it because it just keeps your card count high. Panzer 35T is absolutely critical for this deck. It can be comboed with Blitzkrieg easily. You could get it to 0 operation cost. It has a lot of reach. It can get to the back line, and with 2 defense, it could take out a multitude of things that just has 1 attack. Absolutely critical that you have 3 of these in your deck. Infantry Regiment just gives you draw. Keeping it alive, though, is kind of tough. I usually play it on turn 3 or even 4. It can be countered quite easily, but if this sticks on the board like 3 turns, I win almost every time because I essentially get 3 cards. And typically, my opponent has to waste a card in order to delete this unit from the battlefield, so it works quite well. So worst case scenario, you go card for card, then you draw another card, so you get at least a 1 card advantage. AKITA Regiment is fairly dangerous. It's kind of like a porcupine. You kill it, and then it deals 2 damage to a random enemy. I like flopping that. Whenever there's something that I can remove with 2 damage, a lot of the times it wins me the game, because for my opponent to remove this card, it could deal 2 damage to the base, and oftentimes like getting the enemy base down below 2 damage, it can oftentimes be the difference between winning or losing. So it just has many uses, and it combos with the Panzer 35T because it's infantry. Blitzkrieg, I have 2 of these. I typically discard this if it's in my opening hand. I like to draw into this card because it requires a lot of setup, and you get huge damage spikes with this card, but it can also be a double-edged sword, because if you don't control the front line and you have like 2 of these in your hand, you're probably going to lose. Or if you just don't control the front line and you have 1 of these in your hand, it can be hard to get back on top. So you need to increase momentum early. Your early hands need 2 or 3 1-drops to really kick things off. Dina 3 here gives you draw. It also stops bombers, so that your opponent's going to have to remove this card before attacking anything in the same row because it's a fighter. So it gives you some air defense. A lot of the times I'll combo it with Blitzkrieg. So the turn before I play Blitzkrieg, I'll move this up to the front line. The 3 HP that it has on it is pretty good. SHINHOTO, you got a ton of cards out there, or if your opponent has a ton of cards out there, it can really deal destruction. Quite possibly the best card in this deck, and has so many uses. You want to look for this card even in your opening hand. So if you have this, definitely keep it in your opening hand as long as you have a few 1-drops. Raiding Brigade, we talked about this already. Probably the 2nd or 3rd best card. You have removal. You could also have blitz, so you can move it up to the front line, combo it with expansion. Just, you kind of have to have this card in SHINHOTO to make this deck work. Bombing Raid, top 5 card in this deck. You could take out rows of opponents. It could also win the game for you. There's been plenty of times when the 3 damage to enemy target played on the enemy base wins me the game. I would definitely use this in this deck. And then your finishing move is N1KJ SHIDEN. It's got the Fury, it's got the Blitz and the Ambush, so I consider playing it only if it's going to come down and attack. Best case scenario, it's like way late game and you can attack with it twice. Worst case scenario, you're kind of in a bind. You play it on the battlefield just because it has ambush and there's nothing on the battlefield that can get past the ambush. But I typically only play it if I'm attacking with it right away. Cards that you could potentially swap out or trade, I would consider 56th Recon if you're struggling with removal, like you don't have a bombing raid or a SHINHOTO and you're just trying to make it a Field Marshal. This card is kind of underwhelming though. You do get get to see one of your opponent's cards, which is a good bonus, but it's more of like a control card, a really late pick only if you need it and you're missing some of these 1-drops. Geberg's Pioneer, if you're missing 1-drops, can help you ramp. So I would consider one of these because you get an extra credit every turn. And as long as you have draw, this card is excellent because you can just keep putting cards out on the board, drawing more cards. It's actually great. It opens up things a little bit more for you, but it didn't quite make the cut here. For glory, you might consider if you're having problems with the Soviet deck, there's a lot of elite cards in the Soviet deck that this can destroy for fairly cheap. So I consider if you're going to make a version of this deck that plays a little longer, you might consider adding 4 glory. I noticed unless you're playing up against the Soviets though, it's not really that useful. It's only if you're having problems against the Soviet deck. Soul of Old Japan, I would consider adding if you lack either Signal Regiment or the Shiden, because you could draw those fairly well. It does play a little later. It's always nice to have if it's going to be a long game, but the point of this game is to end it by like turn 5 or 6. So it kind of plays a little bit slower, but if you're missing some of those elite cards, it can be really critical if you need some of these elites. Outflank could be used if you're having problems against guard decks, which would essentially be Soviet or UK. The Type 97 here almost makes this cut because it has the blitz, so it can play on turn 5 fairly well. And since it's a 3/3, it can remove most of what you're going to go up against. It is just quite expensive because it's going to take you 5 to get it into the enemy's support line. So if you're missing like the Shiden or something like that, you could consider adding this card. Enigma is another card that you consider. You could take out potentially the infantry regiment, make this even more of an aggro deck, and then back it up with 1 or 2 enigmas. I haven't experimented much with that, but I'd be curious to see what you guys' thoughts are. Leave comments down below, please. And if you're just missing a big finisher, you could try Key 83. It usually gets removed as soon as it comes down, as well as the Dragon Slayer. But both of these cards, if they remain on the battlefield, can have major game impact. I just would not consider them above Shiden or Bombing Raid. So if you're missing like one of these 2 finishing move cards, consider adding this to your deck. The Key 61 is another blitz card that could come down and potentially be even better than the Shiden because it has an extra attack. So that could replace the Shiden as well if you're just starting out and you're more of a beginner. So there are different ways of playing these decks, and all the cards that I just told you about can easily be added and do well before you get into Field Marshal. Now, when you get into Field Marshal, those slight differences are going to matter quite a bit. So you could definitely get to Field Marshal with replacing some cards here, but once you're in Field Marshal, I wouldn't expect to get into the top 100 unless you have kind of the deck that I'm showing you here. So that's going to be it for the replacement cards. Like I said, consider joining my Discord if you just want to copy and paste this deck. It'll be under the cards section of my Discord. And that's going to be it for this video. If you enjoyed this video, if this video gives you value, please consider giving me a like and subscribing, and I'll see you on the next one.